Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you, David, and everyone that's helped make this possible. As you said, I've been a big fan of the seminars for years, and the journal, obviously. So I'm really excited and happy to be here today. There are a lot of you. Thank you for coming. What I want to do today is talk about, as the title of the talk suggests, disorientation and how disorientation can and probably should unfold specifically in disability studies classrooms. Just a note, I will say disorientation. I think some people say disorientated. Is that a thing? I don't say that. Americans, we just say disoriented. So don't be thrown off. So what I'll do is I'll speak generally about some formulations of disorientation and disorienting encounters. And then I'll turn to actual disorienting encounters that have unfolded in my classroom as a way of illustrating what can be done with these kinds of moments. I was telling David, one way that I start I'm speaking specifically of my introductory disability studies class. I'm going to tell you a story that I always tell on the first day that really kind of literally got my dissertation moving. But first, I want to do this thing that I always do, which is I want to ask, we don't have time for everybody, but if you're feeling outgoing, I would love it if a few of you, we could go around and you could help finish this sentence. Either disability means or disability is blank. And there's no right or wrong answer. Just throw it out there. Maybe someone from this table. Okay.
Disability is socially constructed.
Great, sure. I'm going to try to be neutral.
Okay.
If you say so. No. Great. Thank you. Maybe two more people. Just anybody? Anyone from here? Speak up. Anybody at all? Maybe some of those education folks?
Disability is a pain. When you're in a wheelchair and you've got to go to get up a curb, it's difficult.
Yeah. Now you see, we'll get back to this, but I love how those are two perfectly fine answers and so different. One more, thank you.
Complexly embodied.
Huh. I feel like I've heard that before. Yeah, complexly embodied. Okay, so socially constructed, a pain, complexly embodied. Terrific. Now, normally what I would do if it was a regular class, in the classroom, I would write them all down on the board, and if there were 20 people in the room, you get 18 of the same answer, and then 2 other ones. And then I would go on and explain, okay, those are ways of, definitely all ways of thinking and relating to disability. And I'm going to probably say that word a lot, relating to. Because, just as it's complexly embodied, we know that it's relational. That is, right, meanings and understandings of disability emerge between people and their own body minds and the world around us and one another, right? We know this. So, yeah, that's great. So let me tell you this story. Okay, so a while ago, I was walking with a store manager through this electronics store. We were going. We were walking so fast, and we were sidestepping, shoppers and carts, and we're just flying. Now, it seems that our speed was motivated, I think, by multiple certainties. I was sure of what I wanted to buy. As the manager, he knew where it was in the store, and as far as I know, fully sighted person, he moved with certainty around the people and the things in our way. So as we're walking, he says, what's the story? And, slide. He says, he says, what's the story? And I was actually concentrating on our walking and thinking about my fun new purchase. And so I said, the holidays are coming, and I pretended to be interested in sports. And then he goes, what's the story? Really, demanding it as though on the one hand, there was a story, and on the other hand, I knew exactly what he meant. So I look over at him and I say, he's staring at and gesturing towards my white cane. So what story? I don't know exactly what he wanted when asking for the story. I figure he wanted maybe some sort of medical narrative or diagnosis. Maybe he wanted to know, how is it that I use a white cane and I'm blind, and yet I'm able to keep up with him so quickly and make those turns so fast. Or maybe he wanted to know, how is it, why is it I'm using this white cane, but we're on our way to buy a television. So, while I don't know what I'll never know what he wanted by the story. It's not surprising that he expected there to be one, right? We know from people like Leonard Davis, for example, as early as his book Enforcing Normalcy, he tells us, he says, when one speaks of disability, one tends to place it into a narrative, such that disability becomes only a personal story. And this, he argues, tends to disallow its having any complexity, any cultural or political possibility. And I think that's a very fine point. It's a good point and it's well taken. But we also know from other kinds of storytellers, I'm thinking of Thomas King, for example, tells us the truth about stories is that is all we are. But what I love about this what's the story moment, and the reason that I start with it here and the reason that I start with it in my introductory class, is it tells us a lot, right? It tells us that whatever story this person wanted, he wanted it because he wasn't getting it. Literally and figuratively, right? He wasn't getting it in terms of I wasn't telling it to him, but also he wasn't understanding whatever he thought he was seeing, right? But it's fair to assume from that he has a story of disability, maybe of blindness in mind, and I certainly do too, probably more than one, probably at least the three that you all mentioned, right? And so what I love about these encounters that I'm going to call disorienting encounters is that they reveal that there's always multiple stories of disability, even and especially when we're remaining silent, because I didn't mention it. I didn't say anything. When he said, what's the story? I just kept going. But I did, and I kept walking, but I was really not sure how to go on with this interaction. Quite honestly, what really happened is I bought the television, went to another part of the store, found my wife and said, I've got the dissertation. I've got it. And 3 years later, it was done. So I don't know. Does that all make sense though? Yeah. So far? Okay, great. Now I'm standing in the way of the screen. But wait, you can't read that. Can you read that? Yeah. Oh, okay. So what is it? So I'm going to ask you to join me in reading from the screen from time to time, just for, access. So what does that say? That should say, what's the story at the top? Can you fill in the next line?
Yeah, when we speak of disability, we tend to associate it with a story.
Right, that's Leonard Davis. So I said that.
Yeah, disability is not just something we speak of, it is something we encounter in the world,
Yeah.
in others, in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the story of disability is always being told, even when we remain silent.
I've literally said all of those things. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about, because I know Ria Chin was here relatively recently and talked about all sorts of encounters more broadly. Now, I don't go into it in this presentation, but certainly there can be disorienting encounters with, well, like I've said, with ourselves, with others, and with the things around us in the world. They can also be, maybe it's a physical kind of disorientation, but we can also have that sort of sense of being confused and uncertain, which is more of a, I don't know if cognitive is the right word, but sort of a mental thing. So, all right, so I've got some formulations, different things about disorienting encounters. So would you, is it Samantha?
Amy.
Amy, who's Samantha? Amy, would you do one more?
Yeah, of course. Do you want me to read the whole slide?
Just the one, we'll take
Just
turns.
one. Moments in which legible narratives remain elusive.
Yeah, so let's think about that. Let's think about that with respect to the what's the story guy. Surely there was we have to assume that he knew what he meant when he said what's the story, right? I didn't know, but I came up with three possibilities, right? And yet, in the disorienting encounter, as it says, these are moments when whether it's a legible narrative or the legibility of the narrative, is elusive. You can't quite find it. Whether maybe you can't find the words for it, or you just can't put the pieces together. Yeah. Would somebody else do the next thing?
Moments in which meaning is an open question.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. You know when the presenter falls in love with their own words. But yeah, so I think that's a really important part of it. It's I'm going to call them disorienting encounters with disability. In these disorienting encounters with disability, they are just that. These are these moments when meanings of disability and or our relation to it is questionable. What is the story? What's going on? How do I go on in the face of this particular encounter? What's the next one?
Me again, yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Moments in which our relation to disability is questionable.
Yeah, now, I think that's interesting too, and it's a little bit different. So when you gave your three examples, I think that all expressed a particular relation. We're going to come to call that an orientation towards disability in a moment. But as much as we feel like, oh, I know it. I know what disability is. It's complexly embodied. Okay, that's great, and it is. And maybe it's more than that, right? There can be more to it, and in these kinds of moments, you're not quite sure. Well, what is my relation to disability in this moment? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, wait. Are there any questions about that? Okay. Okay. So in my work these days, at least, I'm getting my understanding of disorientation primarily from the work of Sarah Ahmed, Fiona Kumari Campbell, and Amy Harbin, who's got an excellent book. It came out 2 years ago. It's called Disorientation and Moral Life. If you haven't read it, you should. Amy Harbin, it's Habrin, and AMI is her first name. Yeah. Okay, so these people all tell us things about disorientation. So in excuse me, in Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, she writes a lot about orientation and what it means to be oriented. And she talks about orientation. She writes that it is about facing certain objects, those that help us find our way home. And that makes sense. And so I start, in my thinking, I think, okay, if that's what orientation is, well then what's disorientation? And my first formulation, it's not up here, I don't think, is if orientation is about facing objects that help us find our way, well then certainly disorientation is facing objects that don't help us find our way, or being turned around by objects. She says objects. I'll say objects, ideas, and people that facing objects that make us question our way home. Does that make sense? Yeah. So so Ahmed, towards the end of Queer Phenomenology, describes disorientation, and she says, well, it's what does she say?
Bodily experiences that throw the world up or throw the body from its ground.
Yeah, and so, I mean, you can imagine, have you ever tripped or stumbled and fallen?
Yeah.
It's just like that. Or it seems to be just like that, where you're going along and you're not thinking about the ground under your feet or however you're getting around. I don't know, I bump into things all the time. I'm not thinking about, oh, my shoulder, until bam, I've hit something with my shoulder and my shoulder hurts now. And that's the thing about disorientation. It's not just I would say it's not just bodily experiences that throw the world up, and by that I think she means that take the world, which is typically the phenomenologists would say in the background of everyday experience, because we don't think about it. We interact with things, but we don't really engage with them. And then all of a sudden, something's happened, and you realize, wait a minute, I'm in a world, I'm in a body. It all comes to the foreground. Does that resonate?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's entirely possible, and I think this is something that we can talk about, that part of the reason that disability is or can be so disorienting is its complexity, as you were saying. It's too complex to fully move into the background of our experience. I don't know. I just had that thought. Who's next here? We have, is it a little quote from Amy Harbin?
Yeah.
Now, what does that say? Somebody over here?
To lose one's bearings in relation to others, the environment and life project.
Yeah, so for Amy Harbin, the project of her book is really a reading and I don't want to say critique, but a critical reading of moral philosophy. And she knows in pragmatism, in lots of different kinds of ethical systems, there's an assumption that the right actions, the right thing to do, and the person who acts in the most morally praiseworthy way is the person who encounters a situation and knows what to do and how to do it. And she says, well, that's quite a presumption and that's quite a demand. Things aren't always like that. Sometimes you encounter something that's disorienting and you don't You don't know, as I've said, you don't know what's going on. She uses this term, going on. And maybe you're not quite sure. There's three options. Which one is the best? I'm not sure. Or you have decided which is the best option, but you have no idea how to do it. I don't know. Has that ever happened to you? I'm thinking, this always makes me think of a time I'd spent the day reading and writing about the ethics of touch and disability. I was like, oh, you don't want to, you have to be careful. You don't want to just go grabbing disabled people. And, yeah. But of course, I walked outside, I was going to the movies, and a wheelchair user, but that I didn't know, I was walking past and he says, excuse me, can you help me put my hood up? On his jacket. And I froze. I was like, yeah, I'm going to have to touch your coat. Is that okay? And the whole time he's like, just put my hood up. I'm really overthinking this because, given the context of the day, of course it was disorienting, right? Like this really keen awareness of touch and all the issues that go into it was fresh in my mind. And here he is, please touch my coat. I'm like, ooh, yeah. But so I don't know. That's my example of that. And then while Ahmed and Ahmed and Harbin don't necessarily talk about disorientation and disability, although Harbin does towards the end of her book a little bit, Campbell draws this excellent and very direct connection between disorientation and disability. This is towards the end of her book, Contours of Ableism. And there, in the context of doing something else, she gets onto the topic of disorientation. Now, she's building off of Ahmed's definition of orientation as being about facing certain objects, those that help us find our way, in parentheses, home. And Campbell talks about, she writes that there's a disorientation, in her words, there's a disorientation faced by all disabled people, which she describes as the experience of facing at least two directions at the same time, towards a body that has been lost, towards a place that has been lost, a home that has been lost, and not yet home. So I think there's many things that she could be referring to by this lost and not yet home of disabled embodiment. But I think it's a great description of disorientation in general, but a really poignant and powerful one when it comes to disability, for any number of reasons. So let me comment on those. Did I say all of the Campbell quote here?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So, and I'm sorry, by the way, so I do actually have a draft of an essay for this that I'm more than happy to share with you if you want to contact David and he'll contact me. That's just fine. Because some of this is shorthand from the paper. But, okay. So in all of these, in these, at least in these three formulations or articulations, I like better, of disorientation, it always seems to come up, always in relation to and often opposed to orientation, which sort of makes sense. But one thing that Ahmed and Campbell are doing, I think, is they help us on the way to thinking about disorientation not at all as just a lack or a loss or a lapse of orientation, of our going through the world without thinking about it. towards thinking about disorientation as I do, as a mode of relating to things and people, including ourselves, as a way of. We talk so much in discussions of epistemology about, well, what matters is what do we know and how do we know it and how do we know that we know it. And what I think what we're onto here with disorientation is, well, how do we not know things? What would it look like to have a more robust articulation of not knowing, of being uncertain, of being maybe a little bit confused or unsure? Because that is a very real way of relating, right? This happens. We don't always know. And that can't just be our problem. You know? I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So yeah, so as much as I've written up here to describe very broadly the relationship between disability and disorientation. I've written that, I'm framing it as typically disorientation is thought to disable. Well, to disable what? To disable orientation. Now, of course, when I say disable in that sense, I don't at the moment mean the rich, complex phenomenon. I think it's there, but I do mean disorientation is typically thought as sort of the default bad orientation, right? The disruption or interruption of presumably otherwise smoothly operating orientation. Now that's a little problematic. I'm not 100% behind that definition, but for now it works. Again, maybe we can talk about it. But similarly, and I think this is something that we can probably all agree on, disability disorients or is disorienting. Now, I would argue that, maybe you disagree, that in so much of disability studies, there's a common denominator, and that's this notion that disability is or entails or implies some kind of disorientation. And I don't just mean your more medical model style of, oh, it's a problem body or it's a bad, it's a mind operating aside from otherwise that it ought to be. But rather that we don't, excuse me, what do I mean? Oh boy. Yeah. For example, when David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder write that, they describe disability as a problem, and not only that, as a problem in need of solution. It's possible, I would think, to think of that problem as being, well, it's a disorientation. It's not what's supposed to be, and we know this, right? What I think is useful about framing it in terms of disorientation rather than some other frame is it helps call into question even that much more these sorts of presumptions and assumptions that go into modeling and understanding and relating to disability as a thing and to disabled people, that hopefully can lend to or get us to more careful, more nuanced, not only theoretical work, but also hopefully practical things as well. What? I really can't read that. What else does that say?
The last one is disruptive when, because we know disability.
Yeah. I mean, well, that makes sense. I don't need to explain that, right?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm gonna go for it. Yeah. So, okay. Well, for now, let's return to the what's the story. So, I think so. Disorientation is, and this is what it says, right? It's a disruption, especially in disorienting encounters with disability. I think it's a disruption when and because we think we know the story. Whatever that happens to be, I know what it is. I mean, what we've got, right? We got 3 orientations towards disability right there as social construction, complex embodiment, a pain, and that's fine. Everybody's right. But, well, what else? What if you were to? You must have thought differently about disability at some point in your life, right?
Yeah, of course.
Sure. So, can you? I'm looking and talking to you, but for everybody, can you remember that time when you were exposed to the reality that it could mean something else, or it does. It does mean more than I thought, right?
Yeah.
That happened. Yeah, and now I think that's the value of. That would count for me. That would count as a disorienting encounter with disability. Previously, I've written about this distinguishing between 3 different kinds of disorientation. I've just called them ontic disruption, which is those sort of mild and easily resolvable interruptions, like the door is over there. Okay, I thought it was on the right. I messed up. Okay, not a big deal. You go on, right? And then I've also talked about ontological disorientation, which is that more like you said happened for you. That thing where there's just more. There's just if not a completely different story, a broader, richer, more nuanced perspective out there that I just didn't know about, couldn't even imagine, probably, maybe. And that I think that's where the real meat of it lies. I also talk about that kind of disorientation that you can't get. You can't get out of your head, right? You can't get it away from. Have you ever had that where something happens and it's just nagging at you, even maybe right now? You can remember, if you take a second, that thing, that time. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so I think I've just talking here, talked about disorientation as that moment of exposure, right? You're exposed to something new, but it's not as simple as that. So when I turn to talk about classroom disorientations, I want to come right out ahead of it and say, when I'm talking about them, these are not simply teachable moments. Do you know this expression? Oh, that's a teachable moment, right? Not at least if what you mean by teachable moment is an opportunity to say, hey, Heidi, I'm going to tell you something that you didn't know. Okay, now you know it. We're finished. Those kind of moments are fine, but what I think is most important in the context of disability studies, teaching, but also work, scholarship, is when it's like, hey, I'm gonna tell you something. I'm gonna help you to see something or understand something differently. And then I'm going to let you go with that. And who knows what's going to happen? I don't. And so, for instance, for a few years, I taught first-year medical students. It was a short class. It was only 2 weeks long. So we did a lot. But towards the end, on the second day, somebody would always say, raise their hand, sir, how is this going to make me a better doctor? And what I ended up, I didn't know how to answer that question for about a year. But I figured out an answer, and here it is, and I'm going to stick to it. I don't know. you know, when you have these disorienting encounters, how is this going to, in the classroom, how is this going to make you a better doctor, occupational therapist, a teacher? I don't know. I can't say. But teachers, doctors, occupational therapists, social workers who have had these experiences and remember them are better than those who don't. I don't know. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. Yeah, so that's what I told them, and I have no idea what's happened to any of them since, but I'm sure they're all better doctors. I hope so, at least. Yeah. Okay, great. So, I've outlined three broad ways that disorienting encounters can make an impact in disability studies classrooms in particular. Before I move on to that, do you all have any questions or anything from what we've been doing so far? No questions. Okay. When we do get to the more conversational discussion part of it, for access, I don't know if you all raise your hands to talk, but if you do, don't. Just politely announce that you've got something to say. I'll just check the time. Okay. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'm gonna talk about things that have happened in my introduction to disability. We're gonna edit that out. So now I'd like to turn to talking about the ways that disorientation can be important in the disability studies classroom. I'm going to draw on three to four incidents or encounters that happened in my own classroom over the last 2.5 years. Let me say a little bit about the class and the school. So and the kinds of students. And I have absolutely gotten explicit permission from all the students directly involved in these stories to share these things with you. Believe it or not, because at some point you're going to say, there's no way they agreed to let you talk about that. They did. Yeah, so the students are typically social work students, occupational therapists, physical therapists, some speech language pathologists, some education majors, some special education majors, one philosopher, and the class is the first in our series for the Disability Studies Certificate and for the Disability Studies minor. We don't have a major at the moment. It's also, our classes are stacked, so we get undergraduate and graduates in the same room at the same time. Our student population in general is about 15% Hispanic. A lot of them coming up, many of our students are first generation college students, and a fair number of them are actually the children of migrant, either current or former migrant workers, which is really interesting. It's really kind of fun to be like, you guys have never thought about this, but here we go. Yeah, so let us talk about that. So this thing I've sort of titled a disorienting ableism. It should be obvious that this is something we want to do in the disability studies classroom, right? We know, just like any other orientation, ableist ways of thinking and relating are pretty baked in to everyday life, our everyday typical social world, social interactions, culture, and hopefully we can shake that up a bit. And not only, as I was saying, not just expose in the moment the reality of things like ableism or sexism or homophobia, but also, and this is key, to not just expose, but leave ourselves exposed to these things, these ways of relating differently. Okay, so let's see. Yes. Okay. Okay. So here's where I talk about the things we did in class. I'm gonna come over here. Is this okay for the camera and everything?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So what I do is this one exercise that I've taken from the. Do you know the disability rights group ADAPT?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're as far as I know, the biggest in the U.S. Disability rights group. They have a mentoring curriculum, and this is an exercise that they do in it. So it's called Big Country, Small Country. You divide the class unevenly in half, and the larger half is there. They are the big country, and the smaller half is they're the smaller country. And typically, I describe, okay, big country. You have all the money. You have economic strength, good infrastructure, good resources, natural and otherwise. You're the big country, you know. Smaller country, you don't have those things. And this is a little, I'm not sure I love this, but what you do have, it's a little, I don't have the word for it, not good. You have a long, proud history and culture. You know, that's sort of how I don't love that framing, it's problematic. But knowing that, you're going to have to negotiate big country, small country. The big country wants something from the small country. You get to decide what it is. And then, you know, small country, you don't want to let them have it. So they go off and they figure out their game plan and they come to the negotiation table, 3 representatives from each side. And okay, they do the first round of negotiation. Oh, we want your stuff. No, you can't have our stuff. Oh, and then they break up and then reformulate your plan, you know, right? This is a negotiation. Okay, round 2, but wait. Big country, you introduce some sort of wrinkle. So big country, you've had a natural disaster and you've got real problems. Your infrastructure is a problem. You've lost half your military. Somehow your resources are depleted. Figure out how that affects the negotiation. Everybody knows this happened. Figure it out. Okay, round 3, but wait, small country. You've discovered a huge natural resource. And you've got a lot of, somehow that comes with planes, I don't know. You know, your circumstances have changed. And I'll take it as far as, I'll say, okay, president of the big country, you have really gotten to know and respect this person from the small country. Guess what? You're in love, you get married, you move over there, switch sides. And the same thing, you know, oh, person from the small country, you studied abroad over there, you decide you love it, you move. And then, you know, 3 or 4 rounds of this, they typically never come to a resolution, but that's okay, it's not the point. And then we end it, and we end it with a discussion of power. And I'll say, okay, who had the power here? Not who won, right? But typically that distinction is lost. So the students in the big country will say, well, we did, because we're the big country, and yeah, we didn't get what we wanted, but we're still strong. We have our army and our resources. The small country will sometimes, they'll say, well, no, I think we did, because you know what? We had that cultural piece at the beginning, and even by the end of it, we still had it. So, you know, I think we had the most power. Clearly, we had the most power because we held on to what made us us. And I'll say, oh, can you see what's coming? This is a question for you. Can you see what's coming?
Yeah.
You do?
Oh, gosh.
And then what do I say?
Well, I just thought it didn't matter. They both had power.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, that was wrong.
You have to have power in different ways.
I thought you had the power.
Okay, one of you just said the right answer. Well, so nothing's good or bad. Everything's dangerous. It's fine. Well, that's what okay, you were a lot closer. That's what I'll do. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, great answers, you know, you guys. hey, big country, when you decided to have that earthquake, like, whose choice was that? Well, it wasn't. You told us. Oh, small country, when your circumstances changed, how and why? And they say, well, you told us. And then eventually somebody will say, wait a minute. You kept telling us stuff and changing it. You had all the power. And I'll just say, well, yes. And then we move into a discussion about, that's how power operates, right? We tend to think that we're making choices, we're making the rules, when more often than not, especially in the context of ableism, we're playing by the rules that have been set up by someone, or not even by someone, by something that's much more bigger and subtler than even like a natural disaster, right? Yeah, so ideally, that sets up an opportunity to kind of, well, as I've said here, to disorient ableism, right? To point out that, like any other thing that operates according to, unspoken, unquestioned systems of power, we're just doing them. We're finding ourselves in the context that's already been given, and hopefully, this is an opportunity to interrupt that, to disrupt it, and I don't expect that the whole class is going to go off and become some sort of radicals, but hopefully they don't forget. Oh, remember that thing about power that time? Yeah, that's happening. Like, I can see it in this situation or that situation. Yeah, just do my little PowerPoint notes say anything else? Oh yeah. So okay. So when Amy Harbin writes about these kinds of classrooms, she describes them as critical classrooms, and those are classes that they uproot, right? They uproot typically unquestioned assumptions, histories, and ideas, and they raise the question of, well, whose histories matter, whose ideas, ideologies, and why? How is it that we think power equates with, military strength versus cultural strength? And we don't think, wait a minute, I didn't make that choice. I didn't decide to think or feel this way. I just do. I've just gotten that. I've received that idea or that affect. And so we get it up, as much as it uproots ideologies, I would say it uproots affect. We don't tend not to think about, oh, I feel this way about this thing, let's say disability, not because I have experience with it, which maybe we do, but because I just do. That's what it is. Of course, disability is a bad thing. Oh, really? Why? Well, and then I never really thought about it. Well, right. Yeah. I don't know. Is that making sense? Here, could you read out loud that quote from Harbin at the bottom?
Uproot deeply held assumptions about whose histories and whose ideologies can be trusted. Mm-hmm. And when they do not directly transplant a new, permanently trustworthy root system of assumptions, fundamental blind spots can be revealed.
Yeah, well, we can forget that she says blind spots, but yeah. No, and then that's the thing, just like when I called on Heidi there, the point seems to be, it's not just don't think that, think this, right? But maybe don't think that. Instead, maybe consider consider this. You don't have to agree, but as long as you don't ignore this other thing, this other way of relating. Yeah. Did that make sense to you?
Yeah.
At least? Okay. We can have a discussion about all of this. But any pressing questions or anything? No? Okay. Yeah, all right. Another thing that I think disorientation can do within disability studies classrooms in general, is promote this move that I describe as towards ethics, not etiquette. So I don't know about you, but when I teach, when I taught those medical students, absolutely they wanted this. We would really get into it. Oh, disability is a social construction. It's complexly embodied, and all of this, and they're loving it, of course. But then they'd always be like, okay, wait. So can I ask a blind person if they've seen a good movie? Is it okay if I touch a wheelchair? They always would questions. People want, my students at least, they always want the right answer, or more appropriately here, they want the final answer, right? Tell me what to do and what not to do, and I'll go and do it. And I won't have to think about it, and everything will be okay. Well, that's boring. That's literally the opposite of what I just said that disorientation can do, right? So I'm relying on the slides too much. So, and we know, okay, wait. So what is that? What does the slide say?
First one says, not asking what should be done. Next, in brackets.
Not asking what, right. So typically we want to know what should be done and specifically what should be done next. Yeah, and remember, that makes sense because Harbin tells us that disorientation is the experience of not knowing how to go on. Not knowing, well, what should I do? And should, not could, do. Yeah. What's our next one there?
Openness towards what's to come.
And then last?
And staying in touch with who arrives, not ignoring their specificity.
Right, specificity, like
That's
you said. Yeah. Well, so, okay. And so, we know whether it's from medicine or any number of professions that we get protocols, right? Do this, don't do that. If X, then Y. And sometimes those are useful, right? There's definitely a practicality to that approach. But if we're talking about actual meaningful encounters and meaningful disorienting encounters, well, then you have to throw the protocols out the window, at least a little bit. Here I'm thinking of, do you know the person I'm thinking of who writes about post-conventional ethics? Margaret Shildrick, and is named Margaret Shildrick. Do you know Margaret Shildrick? Yeah, so good, eh? So at one point, she writes about this very thing. She talks about how conventional ethics, like Harbin says, are all about, well, what do I do? What should I do? What ought I to do? What ought I do? Given these options that I can very clearly enumerate. She argues in this one essay I'm thinking of that, well, what actually matters, what's really important here, is for professionals and lay people, is to, she says, to be in touch with the circumstances of people's lives. All of that reminds me of this bit in Queer Phenomenology where Ahmed is talking about ethics and orientation. And elsewhere in her earliest book, her second book as well, and she's talking about, well, if we're going to encounter someone or something, and some people, some ethical systems would say, right, specifics don't matter, right? We want hard and fast, universal rules, and that guide our interactions and our relations and relating, and so just forget all that stuff. And of course, that could be a problem because when we encounter actual people and their ideas, more often than not, I think, it's the particularities and the specifics that matter. That guy that wanted me to pull up his coat, I don't know anything about him. He doesn't know anything about me. But hey, on that particular day, I was very conscious of touching and not touching people. And so that actually did play a part in the interaction, right? Similarly, when it comes to disability and disabled people, we are the experts of our own minds and bodies, right? Usually. And when you interact with professionals, in particular medical professionals and allied health professionals, it's so easy to give up that expertise, right? Because they know best, right? They're trained, and it's, I think, equally just as easy for them to not even think about it and just be, well, I am trained. I do know best. Now shut up and let me tell you what to do. Or let me do for you, with you, to you, what I already know is best without asking you what you want or what you think. So on this track, to get this going, I do this other exercise, which I actually participated in something similar with Petra Kuppers in Michigan at a disability culture. I forget if it was symposium. Yeah, disability culture symposium. I call it a marginal score. So I'll have the students leave the room. You cannot do this on day one. Can't do this on day two. You have to have the rapport, and I've found you have to have more than 7 people in the room. Trust me, it does not go well. Well, so, okay, and this story, like, if you have a visceral reaction to it, please feel free to make that known, because that's what it's calling for. So anyway, students leave the room, and they come back in single file, and as they come in, I stare at them, and I really kind of scrutinize them. I ask them to hold out their hands and turn them over, and I ask if, can I touch your hand for a minute? Sometimes they say no, that's fine. When you look up, look to the left, look to the right, okay, and I'll give them a number. So you're a 3. Go sit. And then, there's usually 0 to 4, and they'll sit accordingly. And I'll say, okay, why? Why are you in group 3? Why are you in group 2? They don't know. I'll say, okay, why are they in group 3 or group 4? Now that they always seem to figure out pretty quickly. That's remarkably easier to do, apparently. Now the point of the exercise is to talk about the speed and ease of judgments and social division and social hierarchical value, right? So we'll guess. We'll go around and we'll guess. Why is it this? Why is it that? Well, one time this happened. We're a few minutes into it, and there's a group of 6 students towards the back of the room. And they're group 0. And I say, okay, everybody, why are these people in group 0? Student at the front of the room, very excited. She goes, as far as I know, white American woman raises her hand. She says, they look like they could all be members of a minority group. I say, oh, no, that's not a good guess. All guesses are wrong. Thanks for playing. And I say, no, that's not it. But people in the room, just a little bit, they're like, oh, she said that. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I like that. That's not nice. And then a minute or two later, okay, we're back to group 0. Why are these folks in group 0? Same student, raises her hand, announces their clothes all look lower class. Yes, that happened in the room too. It seems to happen every time I say it. Room erupts. Oh my God, one of the people in group 0 stands up, starts yelling, that's offensive. And then she stands up, I'm offended that you're upset at me. And it really just escalates into this into this thing. Like, on the one hand, hey, this is a success, but also, okay. And, I think about that particular time, especially with this sense that disorientation can move us towards ethics, not etiquette. Now, certainly, what the two things that she said were not particularly nice, right? They're kind of the sorts of things that you don't say, and this came up. Students afterwards came up to me, and a few mixed, definitely strong opinions, but the consensus was basically, I can't believe she said that. No, excuse me. I can't believe she thought that. I can't believe she said it. With those being distinct opinions. So there was definitely a breach of etiquette here, right? But what we did is we turned it into that discussion of, hey, sometimes, there's different, I can't remember the person who did this right now, but the distinction between different kinds of statements, right? Statements of fact, statements of value, statements of belief. So I think a sociologist. So I introduced that, and I said, okay, now when you say their clothes are all lower class, you probably think you're doing a statement of fact. They're not going to be upset. They know it too. And of course, they didn't know it. They didn't want to know it. Now, this is not one of those times when I was saying, you're exposed to an idea that you hadn't thought of, and now you're going to consider it. This is not one of those times. Or is it? You don't want to go to the group of students that was upset and offended and say, listen, you're close. You had to know. Of course not. No, never. I wouldn't say that. But, considering, like, as I said, a lot of them, they probably could be members of a minority group. It's possible that their clothes do have some class relationship. Actually articulating that out loud in front of them is a different story. But I don't know. I think there's value there. And in either case, if we're going to take it seriously as a disorienting encounter, it's not the time to jump in and say, now, that's not polite, right? Or, I know you're upset, but let's just let it go. And that's the thing. Remember, Harbin says, disorientation is that experience of not knowing how to go on. If, as I agree, if that is to be a valuable moment, then the worst thing to do would be to say, okay, let's just let that go. Let's just move on. Now, Pamela Block and the other contributors of a book called Occupying Disability talk about this as dwelling in your discomfort zone. And it's hard to do. But I think it can be done. And which actually brings me to my last little incident and my thinking about what disorientation can help us do. And I call this, if as Harbin and others say, that, again, I'll just say it, if disorientation is that experience of not knowing how to go on, I think what disorientation in disability studies classes and a disability studies context can do is help us, is be an opportunity or an occasion to figure out how we might go on together, So let me talk more about that. So the question becomes, how do we coexist with other people and ideas who are at best contradictory and at worst, well, really very bad and dangerous. And I do think there's a limit here that we can talk about. But all right, so for the last year or so, I've been hosting a film screening with a philosophy professor at Eastern, and we will invite my disability studies students and his philosophy students, and we'll watch a movie. We recently watched The King's Speech. You know The King's Speech? So the other faculty person was running late, so I was just filling time at the beginning. And I thought, okay, this is mostly his students. Let me tell them about disability studies. And I started just the basic. You know about the social model. So I started out in the classic impairment disability distinction. Yeah? Yeah, okay, sure. So I say hey, 12 people in the audience, let me tell you a bit about disability studies. We have this thing called the social model, sometimes the British social model. It makes this distinction between impairment and disability. And I just hear, just because you make that distinction doesn't mean it's true. And I said, well, what are you talking about? Philosophy is all about distinctions. True? What do you mean? And he explained, the student, genderless, explains, truth with a capital T and all of this. I said, okay, as much as I've said I don't want to just move on, I'm just going to move on. And I said, okay, now here's what that distinction is. Impairment, and I said, okay, and disability, broadly speaking, is about social and cultural marginalization, right? Broadly speaking. So this same student, I'll see if I can do it, all of a sudden, from this same student, you just hear this super loud, pointed, intentional, snicker. Now, at this point, the other faculty person had shown up and kind of had read the room and got wind of this. And he stands up, addresses the person by name, and says, he says, person, everyone in this room is embarrassed because of what you just did. If you can't treat, my colleague and friend with respect, then you can leave. And the person didn't leave. And that idea that we're all now embarrassed. I was embarrassed, a little angry, but definitely embarrassed. The idea that we could all, hey, there's this feeling that we're all apparently sharing, and that is embarrassment. I think that's just incredibly interesting, and I have only just been thinking about it for the last few days, to be honest. Maybe we can talk more about that. But anyway, so that happened. And then a few weeks later, back in the intro class, a student just asked, can I bring my sister to class? She's visiting. I said, sure, of course you can. She does, and we're talking about whatever. We're 7 weeks in. We've got our rapport, we know what we're doing. And I was just trying to fill in the sister, review for everybody else, and fill the sister in so that she felt a part of things. And I said, social model. We were reading Rosemary Garland Thompson's book, Staring, and staring, and we look or don't look, and you're not supposed to look, and all this. And I said, okay, and I turned to this sister and said, does that, Rudy, that's not her name, does that make sense to you? Are you following along? And she said, yeah. For example, you're up in front of the class, and I know that you're the teacher, but if I saw you on the street with your cane, I think you were a nobody. And I'm not saying I'm a somebody, but come on. And not quite as heatedly, but people definitely responded in the moment, in the room, making their opinions of that known, and came up to me afterwards. And again, very much like previously, I can't believe she said that. I can't believe she thought that. And yet in both of those examples, I'm left being the instructor, right? I still have to teach these students or their sisters. And they, ideally, they have to work together, at least for the next however long the class is. And, I think when we broaden that out to, gosh, we live next to and with and work with people that maybe they've got opinions about us because of our race or gender or disability or what have you. And sometimes those opinions mesh. Sometimes they clash. And the thing about the disorientation is how do we, once we do go on from the situation, whether we figured out how to or not, but simply by life, how is it possible to go on together, even if that together isn't an alliance, but just a mutual acknowledgement of the fact that, hey, we coexist. I don't have to like you, but I have to, live with you and work next to you and things like that. And we see that in lots of things. I mean, Harbin writes about that as well when she talks about the critical classroom that uproots things. Ultimately, you have to leave the classroom and go out into the world, and that can be tough. It can be tough. It can be, well, that's easy. You just go and leave. But doing so in a way that retains your exposure to the new ways of thinking and relating and feeling can be so hard, right? Because it's easy just to oh, I've been disoriented. Okay, give me a second. I'm all right now. What I think is important about the disorienting encounters with disability in particular is they're not or not simply moments of uncertainty bookended by confusion and resolution. They certainly can be. Hopefully, they're moments that open us to new things, open perspectives for us. And it's on us, basically, to do our best to stay open, right? Does that make sense? And there's lots of ways, and maybe we can talk about that. But I think that is the end of my slides. Yeah, so I don't know, I said a lot of things. Assuming there's time, I'd really like to hear from you.
We haven't got any time.
Oh no! Really?
Maybe a very quick, yeah, because I'm only booked in here till 3:30.
Oh, and we're at
2 past. So,
shoot.
But if has anyone got any very quick responses?
I've got a really quick question,
Yeah,
Anthony,
nice one.
because I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight. Why are all those people in group 0? That I need to know.
Why do you think? No. Jewelry.
Jewellery.
And that was the thing, yeah. So, I said, hey, you're all in group 0 because, you didn't have any jewelry on. And they'd be like, oh, no, I have this necklace. Hey, sometimes we misjudge. Right? Yeah.
Okay, well, so there's a lesson for life then. You have what jewellery you wear, otherwise you might end up in
Group 0.
Well, we'll have to bring it to a halt, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble with whoever's here next. But I'll just say that we've got the next one is the 7th of March, and that's Gesine Wegner, who some of you already know. She's been here before. She spent 6 months here for the CCDS and so on. But can we just thank Dr. Parrey again?
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll be